Welcome everybody to a fun and highly requested event today with food scientist Selvyn Simoes. I am Celia Du, the RCI Science Virtual Engagement Coordinator. And today we're going to go through the history and science of chocolate from bean to bar to belly. And most important of all, we'll have a taste test of our own assortment of chocolate, along with a few other demonstrations. And they say never to play with your food. So feel free to submit your questions or comments in the chat box or in the comments via Twitter at RCI Science, or you can also email information at rciscience.ca. And just a gentle reminder to be polite and respectful. We do have moderators who are monitoring the chat box and comments, and they will be taking action as appropriate. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our chocolate extraordinaire this evening, Selvyn Simoes. Selvyn is a food scientist from Toronto, Ontario, originally an organic chemist by training. Selvyn has dabbled in the science of solar cells, chocolate catalysis, and food structuring. There's not a single second of the day where he is not thinking about food as it relates to his research or next meal. Same here. Selvyn believes that food brings everyone to the table regardless of life experience. And at this table, Selvyn would like to share his love of food with you. And you can find Selvyn and his shenanigans as they relate to food and science at selvyn.simoes on Instagram. Thank you, Selvyn.
Thank you, Celia. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I think we can bring up my slides. Awesome. So today I'm here to talk to you about the science of chocolate, and I think we can just get right into it. So firstly, cocoa pods are the most important ingredient in chocolate, or rather, they're the most important ingredient that eventually becomes chocolate. So cocoa pods are the fruit of the Theobroma cacao tree, and inside this fruit, there are these white pithy seeds. And if you squeeze the seeds, there are actually fats in there called cocoa butter. And eventually, after processing, the seeds can be converted into cocoa powder. And so both of those are really important ingredients in the formation of chocolate. And so without cocoa pods, there would be no chocolate as we know it today. So firstly, just a little bit of history on the origin of chocolate. Cocoa pod plantations originally started in 600 CE in Central and South America, around the Yucatan and Peru, and they were cultivated by the Aztec and the Inca people. And these beans were very important to their cultures. So much like today, the beans would be harvested and roasted, and then on a stone mill, they would take them and they would grind them into a very fine paste. They would collect the paste, and then they would add it to cold water along with spices and honey, and they would create a beverage from it. But it wasn't until the 1800s until chocolate as we know it today, as eating chocolate existed. So there's a huge gap between, in history, between chocolate or chocolate as a beverage and chocolate as an eaten product today. And so this talk will focus on chocolate as it exists today in an edible chocolate bar form. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. I will talk about how chocolate is made, first of all. We will then sort of transition into what I think is the most interesting ingredient in chocolate, cocoa butter. We'll talk about the different types of chocolate and what makes each of them unique. And then we'll start to delve into some of the more hardcore science, so things like viscosity and emulsifiers, and solid chocolate, which is actually very, very complex, which you'll see later. And to close off, we'll talk about chocolate bloom, which some of you might be familiar with. But as I cover these topics, I hope to take you from bean to bar and beyond, but not really into space. I hope to really just take you into the chemistry of chocolate. So firstly, now cocoa pods are harvested, they're cultivated all over the world. You can actually find them a lot in South America, in Western Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And very popular producers of cocoa pods are Brazil, the Ivory Coast and Ghana, and Indonesia and Malaysia. And you'll actually notice that you could draw an imaginary line between all of these, and that's no coincidence, it's actually the equator. And this is because cocoa pods need a very hot and a very humid climate for them to grow. And so you'll find most cocoa pod plantations, they fall along this equator. So after we've harvested them, we have to ferment them. And so if somebody, for whatever reason, asks you, you know, what's similar between kimchi and chocolate, the answer is that they're both fermented. So what is fermentation? We have some kind of food source like a sugar or a protein, and we feed it to a microorganism. So this could be a yeast or a bacteria. And once we feed it to them, we're interested in the digestion products. So what the microorganisms will take the food and turn it into. And this is actually very popular in food. So in bread, we see yeast turn sugars into gases that cause bread to rise. And in beer and wine, we see the yeast turn the sugars into alcohol. So in chocolate, when you ferment your cocoa seeds, you're actually not making any sort of chocolatey flavors, but you're making molecules that will eventually become chocolate flavors. You have to put a little bit more time and love and effort into them before they become a fully realized chocolate. But without fermentation, you won't end up with chocolate. There's enough fat in these cocoa beans, but there's not, there aren't the correct compounds to produce that flavor. And something that's actually very interesting is during fermentation, there's a lot of heat generated. So in a box of fermenting cocoa beans, the temperature can actually raise to 40, 45 degrees Celsius, and that speeds up the fermentation, so it gets a little bit faster and faster the hotter it gets. But it also kills the cocoa beans, and that's important because it means that the cocoa beans will never sprout, and that's important for not ruining the flavor of the final chocolate. So in the previous slide, I showed you that the fermentation converts sugars and proteins into pre-chocolate compounds. After the cocoa beans are fermented, they're dried. So if you have harvested your cocoa beans in a very hot climate, which is generally the case, you can leave them out in the sun and they will eventually dry. And this prevents the formation of mold. No one wants mold in their chocolate. After they're dried, we want to roast them. And I think the most recognizable process that is similar to this is taking bread and putting it in the toaster. When you take your bread and you put it in the toaster and you get your toast out, it started to brown and the flavor is completely different. And it's also similar to roasting a chicken, right? Like when you take a chicken, you put it in the oven, what you get out is definitely not what you put in. You might eat untoasted bread, but you would never eat a raw chicken. And while it's in the oven, something magical happens. This browning and this flavor is all a product of the Maillard reaction. And this occurs in the chocolates as well. So in the cocoa beans, as they're being roasted, the Maillard reaction will take proteins and sugars and develop them. And so after they've been roasted, these are finally the compounds that contain the flavors of chocolate that you know. So now that we have our roasted beans, we can remove the shells and we can start making chocolate. So we can take them and we can start grinding them. So we have our cocoa beans and we start grinding them with sugar and we get very small particles. And we grind them and we grind them and we grind them. And as they get crushed, some of the fat from the cocoa bean will start to leak out of the cocoa particles. And as more and more fat comes out, it'll start to get more wet. So the fat will start to coat these particles and you'll get this sort of like wet sand like texture. And then as you continue to grind them more and more of the fat comes out until eventually you're left with this very smooth, silky, viscous chocolate that is melted. And it's actually melted because as the rollers are tumbling, they generate heat. You know, if you take your hands and you kind of rub them back and forth, you'll generate heat and you can feel your hands getting hot. And the same kind of idea, the friction that is produced is what is heating up your chocolate here. So after you've ground them and you've ground them and you've ground them, the particles actually become so small that your tongue cannot tell that they're there. And I think an easy way to think of this is I live with a cat. I love my cat, but every single second of every single day, there's cat hair in my mouth. And I know that there's cat hair in my mouth because I can feel it. My tongue and my lips can tell me that there's the hair in my mouth. It sends a signal to my brain, and then my brain is like, get the cat hair out of your mouth. But these particles are smaller than the width of a cat hair. They're so small that neither your lips nor your tongue can tell that they're there. So when you eat chocolate, you just get that smooth, creamy sensation on the inside of your mouth. And so now that we're all experts in chocolate making, I can show you from start to finish somebody making chocolate. Now, I found this on Reddit. If you want to see this again and again, you can go onto any search engine and you could search up making chocolate from scratch. And you can find it. But without further ado, I can show you this condensed version of chocolate making. So the seeds are extracted and they're put in a bag for fermentation. They're poked holes. Holes are poked in the bag so that air can escape or gases can escape. This is them just putting it in a fermentation vessel. And now they're going to collect them and let them dry on a sheet. Here we see them being roasted. The shells are removed. And then they give them like an early sort of grind, just so it's easier to grind later. So here in a mortar and pestle, you can see them start to grind it further. They're adding spices like vanilla beans. And eventually the fat comes out. So they've collected it, they can now melt it, they can add salt, and now they can pour it into molds. And once it solidifies, you get your chocolate. So awesome. We've seen chocolate from start to finish, from bean to bar, as they say. But now let's take a closer look at some of the ingredients, and more namely cocoa butter. So cocoa butter is a product of the cocoa pod, but it's also everything. It is coating all of the particles in your chocolate. So all of the cocoa and all of the sugar are surrounded by this cocoa butter fat. And chocolate at room temperature is a solid, but when you put it in your mouth, it's liquid. So it melts in your mouth. And that is because the cocoa butter is transitioning from a solid to a liquid. So inside your mouth, it is warm enough that the molecules in the cocoa butter are starting to get enough energy that they can just start sliding past one another and move into the liquid phase. And this is because, and this sort of characteristic is very unique to cocoa butter. And it's one of the reasons that chocolate is really amazing, that it is solid at room temperature and will melt in your mouth. And because cocoa butter is what is coating every single particle, that's what gives it its sort of like melting behavior. What's more interesting about cocoa butter, though, is depending on where it's grown, it can actually have different characteristics. So depending on the rain season, depending on the climate, you can actually get harder, so cocoa butters that melt at higher temperatures, or softer cocoa butters that melt at lower temperatures. But so a lot of the physical properties, like the melting of chocolate, come specifically from the cocoa butter. And now let's talk about the different kinds of chocolate. So the different types of chocolate that you're probably used to are white, milk, and dark chocolate. And in general, they have a very specific formulation. So if you look at white chocolate, you can see that it has some form of cocoa butter, it has a little bit of milk fat, but it has no cocoa solids. So there's no actual cocoa solids in white chocolate. But if you take the same formulation and you start to add cocoa solids, you'll actually get something that's closer to a milk chocolate. And if you increase the amount of cocoa solids, you'll actually get something closer to a dark chocolate. And you'll notice that on all of these, I actually have these greater than signs. And that's because these numbers are taken from the Government of Canada's website, because there is a lot of regulation on what can be classified as chocolate. So these are the base amounts of ingredients that you have to put in chocolate for it to be considered chocolate. That being said, you can still mix and match. So because there's milk fat in white chocolate, the white chocolate melts at a very low temperature. Milk fat is very soft. So white chocolate tends to be a little bit more creamy. Dark chocolate, on the other hand, doesn't have any milk fat in it, generally. And it has a lot of cocoa particles. So it tends to feel a little bit more waxy, a little bit more solid when you bite into it. It has a little bit more stiffness. But some companies will take dark chocolate and add a little bit of milk fat. So you still end up getting those very deep, dark, chocolatey flavors, but then you also get that nice creaminess from the milk fat when it's added to it. And then there are also some types of chocolate, dark chocolate in particular, that has 70, 80, 90% cocoa, and those are very bitter. And I think they appeal to a niche market, but I think they're a little less popular than the sort of traditional formulations. And in more recent years, we've actually seen the development of a new type of chocolate, and this is ruby chocolate. So this was developed by Bayer Callebaut in 2017. They'd apparently been developing this for 15 years, since 2004. I just outed the fact that I can't do math. 13 years. And so it was branded as a new type of chocolate, and it was amazing because it has this stark pink color. And the flavor is actually different from any other chocolate as well. So it's a little bit more sour, a little bit more astringent. And it has more fruity notes to it. So it has a little bit of raspberry undertones. And there's actually a lot of controversy about whether or not it is a real chocolate, because the restrictions on what can be called chocolate are very strict. It's not very well defined as to whether or not this constitutes chocolate. I personally believe that it is chocolate if you can consider white chocolate chocolate. With no cocoa solids in it, I would consider this chocolate. So the way that this is made is very similar to the other chocolates. You have your cocoa pods, you ferment them for a specific amount of time, but the only difference is that it's fermented for a little bit shorter than the other types of chocolate. So that gives you a lot of those astringent, sort of like acidic flavors. And the type of cocoa pod that you use to produce this chocolate is also a little bit different. And so that's why it's sort of considered its own type of chocolate. I personally believe that it is sort of like a new type of chocolate. I don't think it's like not chocolate. But there are a lot of products that are not chocolate. So if you go to the grocery store and you see something like a chocolate syrup that you add to milk to make a sort of chocolatey milk, you'll notice that on the packaging, it actually doesn't say chocolate product. It says chocolate flavored product. And that's because it doesn't meet those regulations to actually be considered a chocolate product. And coming back to the regulations, if you were in the United States, if you're in Europe, there are different regulations wherever you go. So if you like European chocolates, it could very well be that just the standards are different. And so the way that they make it, you enjoy a little bit more. So now we're at the interactive portion of the evening. So in preparation for today, you were asked to pick up a white, a dark, and a milk chocolate, and now you're going to taste them. So you're going to take little bites of them, and you're going to chew them a couple of times and let them melt on your tongue. And so what I want you to sort of notice is that the dark chocolate is sort of the waxiest. It is sort of the hardest in terms of the white, in terms of the three. The milk chocolate should be a little bit creamier. It should melt a little bit more readily. And then the white chocolate should melt even more readily. And the white chocolate will actually have more of a milky flavor than a chocolate flavor because there's no cocoa powder, but there is still milk powder in it. If you are lucky enough to have ruby chocolate, then by all means, go and try it. I've not tried ruby chocolate yet, but I'm hoping to in the next couple of weeks. And so as you're sort of going through these chocolates and tasting their textures, you were also asked to purchase a Hershey's Kiss. And this was sort of like post-Valentine's Day. It doesn't matter if it's like milk chocolate or dark chocolate, but after you finish your white milk and dark chocolates, I want you to try your Hershey's Kiss, and hopefully you have a different Hershey's Kiss than the brand of other chocolate that you bought. But when you let it melt in your mouth, I want you to notice that it's a little bit more astringent than the other chocolates. There's something a little bit sour, a little bit like sharper in the chocolate profile. And that's because when it's being ground, all of those acidic compounds might not come off, or when the milk products are being added to the chocolate, they contain some kind of like acidic compounds that give you that sort of astringent flavor. And so this is very noticeable in Hershey's chocolate, or at least it is to me. But I would definitely look for that sort of like sharp, astringent, sour sort of flavor in those Hershey chocolates. Okay. So now that we've taste tested some chocolate, we can move into some of the more hardcore science. I'm going to talk about viscosity, and I'm sure all of you have some concept of viscosity, right? Like you go into your kitchen, you think of viscous liquids, you can think of molasses. Honey is probably the most common thing that you would think of. And so the way that you would describe this is it is very viscous, or it is very thick. And if you want to think of something that is less viscous, you could think of something like water. So in comparison, I would say the water is thinner than the honey. So it is less viscous than the honey. And so chocolate is actually quite viscous when it's molten, when it's melted. And it's because there's all of these particles that are suspended in your cocoa butter. There's so many particles, it's basically a paste. It is a paste. Not quite the same as toothpaste, but it's because you have all of this sugar and all of these cocoa particles in such a small amount of cocoa butter. If you recall the ingredient list that I was showing you, it was 20% cocoa butter, right? So all of these particles have to be fit into this small amount of cocoa butter. But it gets worse, because if you think about coating a single particle in your cocoa butter or your fat or whatever, and you imagine like the fat is wrapping paper, you need a very specific amount of wrapping paper to coat your particle. But once you start to crush this same particle into smaller particles, you can now see that this amount of wrapping paper is no longer enough. So you've spread your cocoa butter even thinner. There's more surface that you need to cover with the cocoa butter. Why do they add salt to the chocolate making process? Sorry, I'm looking at the chat. So you should add salt to everything. Whenever I make food, I always add way too much salt, according to other people. I love how much salt I add. But salt is a flavor enhancer. Just like sugar, when you add it to foods, salt is very important for sort of like having all those flavors like reach the signal into your brain. Oh, sorry. Apparently those questions were not for me. Sorry about that. Okay, so you can see that you need more of this solid fat or the cocoa butter to cover these particles. Great. But what this means is because chocolate is very viscous, it's hard to pump in a factory. So it needs a lot more energy to actually push the chocolate to different parts of the factory, to push into molds. And then when you're making some like chocolate products, like a chocolate coated biscuit or an ice cream cone that's dipped in chocolate, you want the chocolate to be thinner. You don't want this huge, thick coating of, maybe you do want a very thick coating of chocolate on your ice cream. But how do we get around this thickness? How do we sort of change this from a very viscous material to something that's thinner that could be pumped more easily, or that we could use to coat cookies or biscuits or an ice cream? How could we make it thinner so that it can coat all of these things more easily? And the answer is emulsifiers. And you have emulsifiers in your home. You probably have a lot of them, actually. But the most common one is soap. So when you think of oil and water, you know that they don't mix. If I just poured oil onto water, it would just sit on top. There's even if I shook it, eventually they would separate out into two separate separate phases, so a water phase and an oil phase. But if I add soap, I can now take those oil droplets and I can suspend them in the water. I can make these very small droplets that don't separate out as quickly. And that's because the emulsifier that we've added, the soap that we've added, has a region on its molecule that loves oils, and it has a region that loves water. So this molecule will sit between the water and the oil, and it'll allow them to sort of interact. So it'll allow those droplets to exist. And I know that chocolate contains no water, but the emulsifier will act in the same way. So the emulsifier will sit at the surface of all of these tiny particles, and it'll allow them to sort of glide past one another. And it increases the lubrication between them. So you can go from this very thick chocolate that sort of sits on itself and forms this little mountain to a thin chocolate that will coat a cookie or coat an ice cream cone and is easy to move around a factory. So now is the part of the presentation where I show you a demonstration because I don't believe that you'd be able to do it at home. So here I have a mixture of sugar and oil. This is sort of like a stand-in for chocolate. So it's sugar particles, it's confectioner's sugar, and it's just olive oil. These are things I had in my kitchen, and I can take my knife and I can cut into it. You can see that it's very solid, right? It forms a dough, it supports itself. If I wanted to recombine it as a paste, I could. But it's very solid. It supports itself, it's not a liquid, and it's not flowing. So I here have some emulsifier that I'm going to add to it. And now I have my little cake of sugar and oil. And so this is just a paste. And it's supposed to stand in as chocolate, and I'm just going to add a little bit of emulsifier. And it's going to inch very slowly towards my sort of mixture here. You really don't need a lot. In fact, what I'm adding is probably too much. But you can see that now as I mix it, it'll go from a solid paste to something much more liquid. So there is like a little bit of time that's involved in sort of taking it and mixing it in. But isn't that amazing? So now I've taken something that was very viscous. It was supporting itself. Right? I could form a little dough ball, and now it's a liquid. And all I did was add a little bit of emulsifier and move it around with a knife. I could play with this all evening, but I won't for your sake. So I also have a second demonstration for you. And you can do this one at home as well. So if you have some chocolate and you don't mind parting with it, because this will ruin the chocolate, I would take it now and I would go to a microwave, or if you have a even a pot on the stove full of water, if you put another bowl on top and heat it up and stir the chocolate, you really just want the chocolate melted. That's really what we're trying to achieve here. So I have mine sitting in a hot water bath. So I can just take mine out. And so this is just regular chocolate, milk chocolate that you would see at the store. I'm just trying to mix it just so that it's thoroughly combined. You can see that it's, as you would expect, It's a little bit more solid than I thought it would be. But as it heats up, it should be very liquidy. But it will eventually flow. So it will form these nice ribbons that sort of drip down into the container. So you can see that they're these nice long ribbons. And now I'm going to add a little bit of water to it. And so now as I mix it, you'll actually start to see, I might have added a little bit too much water, but it'll start to thicken. And so here what's happening is we're doing the opposite of the emulsifier. So rather than letting the particles slide past one another and sort of, increase the lubrication in our chocolate, we're doing the opposite. We're making it thicker and thicker and thicker because the particles are now sticking together. The water is causing the particles to sort of come together and form like a large mass. I've actually added too much water, and so now it's very it's thinner than it should be. But at home, if you have some chocolate and you want to try it, just take some chocolate, melt it, add a little bit of water. Definitely don't add as much as I did, and mix it around, and you should see it start to form a very solid mass. Okay, so we can bring up our slides again. Awesome. So now let's talk about the solid properties of chocolate. And this is where we really start to get into the more interesting scientific aspects of chocolate. So as we said earlier, if you have a solid, all of the molecules are sort of arranged in this very nice, organized sort of manner. And that's what makes it a solid, right? The particles are sort of organized, they can hold together. And they form a specific structure. But with cocoa butter, you can actually form multiple different structures. These aren't true to life. There's actually a lot of research that has gone into the structures that cocoa butter can form. But these are just sort of, taking the same sort of shape of molecule and showing you how many different sort of arrangements you can put them in. And you can imagine that they would all have their own individual properties, right? Like if I were to make walls out of all of these, they would all sort of behave a little bit differently. So cocoa butter actually has 6 different structures that it can form. And in scientific literature, you would actually see them denoted with a Roman numeral from 1 to 6. But for simplicity, I've put them here with just regular numbers. And so all of these will actually melt at different temperatures. Because the structural arrangements are a little bit different, their melting points are different, right? Their melting characteristics are different. So you can sort of assume that if you start at 1, this has the lowest melting point. So this might melt, in your hands rather than being solid at room temperature. And then 6 being the highest melting. So this is the hardest cocoa butter, the hardest structure that is formed. And it's important because when you make chocolate, you really only want this one specific structure. So here I have 2 images. These are actually chocolates that I've made. And here in this image, I have the structure 4. I have the form 4 structure. You can see that it's kind of crumbly. It's a little bit gray. And here in the lower image, I have some chocolate that I've made in form 5. So it has the right structure that you would see in a commercial chocolate. You can see that it's a little bit glossy on the surface. You can see where there's a snap, it's not crumbly. It has a very smooth junction where the bar was broken in half. And if I were to hold these 2 in my hands, this would actually melt in my hand, but this shouldn't. So how do we pick this one structure? How do we physically take chocolate and only get this one type of structure? So this is called tempering. And we can do this because you can actually take some of the lower structures and they can sort of transition. They will go from one structure, and if you do you put a little like effort in, they will turn into the next structure. And so they melt at a little bit higher of a temperature. And then that can continue on, and you can actually get them to go all the way through. So here, I'm going to show you how to temper chocolate very, very briefly. Actually tempering chocolate is very tumultuous. It's rather difficult. It took me a very long time to actually get like okay at it. But there are two kinds of methods that you can do to get a tempered chocolate that you would find in a grocery store. So here I've given the forms sort of like structures to differentiate between the two, between all of them. And so if you have a melted chocolate and you do the unseeded method of tempering, you will cool down your melted chocolate until solids start to form. And the structures that form are a mixture of all of them. So they're a mixture of all of these different kinds of structures. And you know that some of these structures melt at different temperatures. So if you raise the temperature, you can actually just melt away these lower structures because we don't need them. So once we have these desirable form 5 structures, we can then let it cool down further, and the full chocolate will be that nice, glossy, snappy chocolate. And the next method is kind of cheating, but it works really well. It's a lot easier to do, and it's called the seeded method. So you take your melted chocolate, and then you have some solid chocolate on the side that you saved, and you cut it up, and then you throw it in. And so you're adding these form 5 seeds, and from these seeds, you can actually get your solid chocolate product. So, you know, you can get it to sort of grow off of these seed crystals that you're putting in. And this is a much easier way, and a lot, it's more forgiving, but it's not necessarily significantly easier to perfect. So lastly, I want to talk about chocolate bloom. Some of you might have seen this. I have never left chocolate long enough to actually experience this. It always goes away very quickly when it's in my hands. So it's this whitish gray coating on the surface, and it's a little bit daunting. It can be a little bit scary, but it's still safe to eat. But the flavor is a little bit different. And that's because we've gone from the structure that we want to the next structure. You know, if you can go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, why couldn't you go from 5 to 6? And that's exactly what's happening here. Once you have your finished chocolate and it transfers from 5 to 6, you then start to get this grayish coating. And because it melts at a higher temperature than 5, it's now waxy in your mouth. And it tastes a little bit like, it's a little more unpleasant to eat. But it's completely safe. So this happens over time. Eventually, over time, these will all start to transition through until they get to the highest melting structure, or with changing temperature. So if you have Halloween candy from like 2 or 3 years ago, if you open one of them up, you might find a bloom chocolate. Or if you forget like a chocolate bar in your car, and during the day your car is hot and at night your car is cold, you might start to see this bloom chocolate. And the exact reason that this actually happens is still unknown. This is still a big topic of research. There's tons of literature on this, trying to figure out what exactly is happening on the molecular scale. But we still don't know the exact reason. We just know that once this transition happens, this is this sort of like coating that you see on the outside. And so that actually brings my talk to a close. And before we go, I have some homework for you. And I hope that you're not sitting at home going, I was hoping I didn't come to this educational talk and I didn't want to get homework, but it's easy, it's very easy. So the first thing I want you to do is talk to someone about chocolate. I want you to take some of the information that you've seen here, and I want you to now be the science communicator. I want you to go and, you know, spread the information to someone else. And the next thing I want you to do is a little bit different, and it has nothing to do with chocolate, but I want you to think about the things that make you feel gratitude, especially now with the state of the world as it is. it's easy to sort of go down rabbit holes and, feel not so good. But thinking about the things that make us feel grateful and the things that, really make us happy really help us stay positive and see, the brighter side of life. And I want to show you people that make me feel gratitude. So none of these people actually contributed to this presentation, but these are people who exist in my life that I see on a regular basis. These are people who have impacted my life in some meaningful way. And so if you're thanking me for this presentation, you're really thanking all of these people and multiple other people for their contribution to my life. And so lastly, I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I would love to thank RCI Science for inviting me to give this talk. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you so much, Selvyn. There is so much about chocolate I had no idea about, and just learning all of the different things that we've thought about chocolate that maybe we got wrong or maybe we got right. So before we get to questions, actually, we actually like to play a game called Some Questionable News. We've got some headlines that we've prepared, and audience, feel free to join along with us. But we're gonna see if Selvyn can figure out which headlines are real and which headlines are totally made up. So let's get to the first headline. Chocolate chemical boosts memory in old age, finds study funded by chocolate company. You think that's real, or do we make it up?
I think this is real.
Is it? All right, let's see. It is real. Okay. Yes, you're very good at this. So with some, just to make sure that we contextualize this within science, it was a small trial. The participants had to do like 3 memory tests. And the scientists themselves that needed longer and more large-scale studies in order to confirm this, but it's really connected to the chemical flavanol, and they were looking at intake and performance. There were 3 memory tests, but really only one of them did they see any significant difference, and the researchers were like, chocolates are not a reliable source of flavanol, and also the study does not suggest that eating chocolate is good for our cognitive health. So
I can speak on this. So yeah. I showed you that chocolate is very complex, but yeah. I feel like I shouldn't have to convince you that you are significantly more complex than chocolate. Like you as a person, there's so much more going on, right? You're not just like a couple of ingredients. So to actually understand how food impacts the way that your cognitive ability works, the way that your brain works, that like we truly don't even understand. It's such a hard field, and it's such difficult research to like really sort of muddle through and get meaningful insights into.
Yeah, for sure. That's an important point to remember whenever we see studies like this. It's really hard to get some conclusive statements like this, right? All right, let's move on to the next headline. To chocolat or choconut, is chocolate really addictive?
Do you want me to sort of explain my reasoning as I'm going through?
Oh, yeah. Go for
okay.
it.
Okay, I feel like this title is amazing. I feel like because this is a pun title, I can already tell you that my initial instinct is like, this is real. This is like somebody has published this. But my second thing is that chocolate actually contains a lot of sugar, and we know that sugar is very addictive. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is a real study because I think that the sugar in chocolate can be the addictive, component in it.
Right. All right. Let's see. It is not real, but I will say that it was inspired by many similar headlines of is chocolate addictive?
Maybe that's the next work I'll do.
Yeah. Yes, we need the definitive answer and feel better about ourselves, maybe. Great. Let's go to the next one. Ritter Sport is told its new no sugar bar is not chocolate.
So I think this one is true. I showed you guys the regulations. Wait, hold on. Some things you have to have a very, there's a minimum amount that you can have in your chocolate. So you have to have a minimum amount of milk fat or cocoa butter. but there's also maximum amounts. So in white chocolate, in some regions, there's a maximum amount of sugar that you can add.
Right.
So I fully believe that somebody somewhere was like, this is not real chocolate. You have to stop calling it chocolate. It's now a chocolatey product.
A chocolatey product. That's how they like spin it. All right, well, let's see.
Chocolate flavored.
Yeah, it is real. And I think it says Germany. They don't have any sugar in this product, but instead of sugar, I think they use like cocoa juice or something like that to replace the sugar. And because of the regulations, it can't be categorized as chocolate. So that's a whole discussion on what can and cannot be chocolate. It seems like the food industry has many things in place, which can be good, right? All right, let's go to the next one. I think this is the last one. Happy Chocolate Day, the science behind the strong connection of chocolates and romance. What do you think?
Okay, so there are two things that are going through my mind. This is either just sort of like, this came out as Valentine's Day, people are trying to sell their chocolate. It's like a marketing tactic, like for an article, it was just like, here you go, chocolate, romance, like you give someone chocolate, they'll fall in love with you. I think it's fake.
I think it's fake. Okay.
Yeah.
Good guess. It's real. It's hard. Some of these headlines,
They're convincing.
Yeah, they are. Thank you so much for playing along. And for those of you who were playing with us, I hope you also enjoyed it. And, let us know if you beat Selvyn or not, or maybe you tied with him. So let's move on to the questions. I think the first question we want to address is, what is your cat's name? And can we see your cat, please?
Her name is Velveeta, like the cheese. So there's, if you go to the grocery store, there's like real cheese. There's like a real cheese section, and then there's a fake cheese section, which is like Cheese Whiz. And Velveeta is a fake type of cheese.
Oh.
So that's her name. I can see if she'll come.
So are you a huge fan of Velveeta? Is that why? Or?
No, actually, I don't eat. I'm lactose intolerant.
Right.
I don't know. I just saw her and I was like, she is made of cheese.
Oh, fair enough.
She's very sweet. Cute. She's 8 years old. She's very upset with me because I had to close the door so that she wouldn't interrupt us.
Right. And she was not happy about that. I get that. I have a dog as well, and he will not let me do that. Perfect. So let's go on to another question. Someone asked, how is cocoa butter separated from cocoa solids?
So this is a really good question. If you want to isolate just the cocoa butter alone, you actually just squeeze them, right? Your cocoa butter is a liquid, but your cocoa solids are solid. So if you start to sort of compress them, and you keep compressing and compressing, I know that chocolate, because it's all one color, it looks like it's just one material, but you could actually get rid of the cocoa solids. You could separate the cocoa butter and the cocoa solids. Okay. So actually, I think you can do this at home. This is a really cool one. If you take a piece of chocolate and you cut it up really finely, or you could use a grater and you could get really small pieces. In a glass, just add the cocoa butter and add hot water. You want to add boiling water and you want to stir very, very slowly. Okay. And when I say slowly, you should not see any swirling at the top of the liquid. You just keep stirring slowly, slowly. You can keep heating it. And because the cocoa butter, as a liquid, once it's melted, is less dense than the water, your cocoa particles are solid and they'll sink to the bottom, and your cocoa butter is a liquid, and because it's less dense, it floats to the top. So you can separate them that way. Oh. And that's a really cool experiment to do at home.
All right, so we have another piece of homework for our audience to try at home. That's really cool, actually. I didn't realize you could do that. And then this came from our Hershey's part of the demonstration. Does the sharp or stringent flavor in Hershey's come from a cheaper production value? Is it less expensive to produce chocolate that way?
It's hard to say. It can come from a bunch of different, there are a bunch of different like ways that you can think about it. I've never worked at Hershey's. I've never spoken to anyone who has worked at Hershey's. I hope they don't send me an email after this telling me that they hate me.
Or they'll sponsor you.
Ooh, please. So it could be that it's just an ingredient thing. It's not necessarily a price thing. It could just be that it's from an ingredient that they use. Maybe they like that sort of astringent flavor. You have to think about, like, not everyone likes the same thing. So like some people are really weird and love that 99% dark chocolate where there's no sugar in it. It tastes like soot when you eat it. I personally really don't like it, but there's some people that do, right?
Yeah.
And that 99% dark chocolate also has a very astringent flavor. Cocoa, here's something else you can do. If you are home and you have cocoa powder at home, not like the quick dissolve cocoa powder, whatever, like real cocoa powder, just take a small bit on a spoon and put it in your mouth. You'll feel that sort of like drying, astringent flavor, and you'll sort of feel your mouth start to like pucker a little.
Right.
And so that astringency is actually part of chocolate. Like that exists within the chocolate in and of itself.
Right.
But there's so many other places that it could come from. It's not necessarily a price thing. It could even be just like a formulation thing, right? Like it could just be based on their original recipe that they just always did. And so now if you want like an authentic Hershey's experience, you're just getting the chocolate that they made the way they made it.
Their flavor.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, so with this discussion of chocolate being, I feel like, you know, like especially dark chocolate being a power food or something, some people are wondering if, you know, cocoa butter or cocoa solids, are they sort of the important part of making chocolate? It's the powerhouse. Like what is the powerhouse of chocolate?
It's hard to say. If you took out any individual piece of the chocolate, you wouldn't have chocolate. There's so few ingredients in it, right? If you took out the cocoa butter, it wouldn't melt in your mouth. It would just be a bunch of powders, right? If you took out the sugar, you would have a very bitter chocolate, like that 99% dark chocolate. If you took out the sugar, it wouldn't be there to balance, you know, those bitter dark flavors. And sugar, like I was saying earlier with salt, is a flavor enhancer. So you can actually, you know, you get better flavor detection in your mouth when you have both sugar and salt present. That's why people like salted caramel.
Right.
Actually, in Thai foods, like Thai cuisine, there is palm sugar that's added to the food because it balances out those like spicy, sour, you know, like those really like complex flavors. So if you took out any individual component of chocolate, I would say that you wouldn't have chocolate.
Right.
And that also means that, you know, maybe I don't consider white chocolate because it doesn't have cocoa particles. But,
right.
Feel free to call me out of that.
Well, that now makes sense, like why people say like white chocolate isn't necessarily chocolate, but then you could argue that it is.
Yeah, it's there's a lot surrounding what is and what isn't chocolate.
Yeah, surprisingly a lot of controversy about that. And then this question came up during your emulsification demonstration. What was in the emulsifier that you were using?
So an emulsifier is any molecule that has that portion on the molecule that likes oil and the portion on the molecule that likes water. So soap in your fridge, sorry, not in your fridge, maybe you could get in your fridge. Soap, your dish soap is an emulsifier. What are other emulsifiers? There are emulsifiers like in mustards, in eggs, when you're making cakes and stuff. There's all sorts of different emulsifiers there, and they're all unique, and they all have their own unique properties. There's like literally like an unfathomable amount of emulsifiers that are in existence. The emulsifier that I used is polyglycerol polyricinoleate, which is a very long chemically sounding name, and I'm sure it's scary. There are actually like Facebook pages dedicated to like removing it from chocolate.
Oh, wow.
In the amounts it's in chocolate, it's quite safe.
Yeah.
But this specific emulsifier, I used it because I knew that when I added it to the sugar and the oil mixture, it would become a liquid. If I bring my sugar and oil mixture back down, you can see that it's flattened out into a puddle.
Right. Oh,
So
yeah.
it's not that it re-solidified or anything, it stayed as that, it reduced its viscosity permanently as I added it to it. And
Right.
you really only need a tiny amount.
Right. Okay. That's good to know. Yeah, just because it has a long chemical name doesn't mean it's not safe. And so we had a question, I guess this is more on the health end, but someone's asking if chocolate has the most antioxidants.
Honestly, I don't know.
That's fair.
I will share that when I'm looking for antioxidants, I'm not eating chocolate. I'm probably eating like blueberries, but
okay, so likely not. Blueberries.
There are other places to get antioxidants. Yeah. They do contain antioxidants, but I don't know which one would have the most.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that's something that we can investigate, perhaps.
It's because each step, like the fermentation, the drying, the roasting, depending on how long you roast it, all of those things can change the amount of antioxidants in there. So each chocolate is really unique and individual in like its composition and the antioxidant profile.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, I mean, back to the different types of chocolate. Can you highlight again the melting points for each chocolate?
Yeah, so white chocolate will melt around like 29 degrees, milk chocolate 30, and dark chocolate will melt around 31. So it's really like a very slight difference, but it is noticeable.
Right. That's good to know. I didn't realize how close they would be. Is it a myth that chocolate makes people break out?
I don't know. I used to want to be a dermatologist, but I think it's the sugar. Actually, I know that sugar has been linked to acne, but I can't say for certain whether or not chocolate will cause breakouts.
Okay.
Or if you're allergic to milk, like that could also cause breakouts. Like there's so many reasons it could cause.
That's so true. Yeah. Again, the complexity of the human body, right?
Yeah.
And someone asked about how climate change has affected the production of cacao.
Yeah, so actually there's a lot of research and work that is going into replacing cocoa butter or like substituting it for other fats. But because it's so specific in the way that it melts in your mouth at like body temperature, it's so hard to replace.
Right.
And actually, if you replace the fat with something else like palm oil or like some different kind of fat, it might no longer be considered chocolate because you've changed the composition. But we also have to remember that, any sort of crop that we overfarm, things that we, plantations that reduce the biodiversity of any sort of given region, they're detrimental to climate change, and they'll make things worse, right? They won't solve their own issue by replacing them with another crop.
Okay. That's good to know, something good to keep in mind. So we just have a couple more questions to answer. Is lecithin is a common ingredient people have noticed in chocolate. Is that an emulsifier?
Yes. So lecithin, most popular is soy lecithin. So it comes as a byproduct of processing soy. And originally it was a waste product, but it is probably like the most common emulsifier that is added to chocolate. And it is indeed an emulsifier. It is specifically added to reduce the amount of fat that you need to coat your particles,
right?
And to help with the flow of your chocolate.
Right. Cool. And then our last question: what is the best temperature to temper chocolate, or does it depend on the type?
So it definitely depends on the type. If you think about like milk chocolate, which melts at 29 degrees, and dark chocolate that melts at 31, you can't temper milk chocolate at 31 degrees because everything's melted. That structure that you want that is solid at 29 degrees doesn't exist. It's 31 degrees, right? Yeah. So it really does depend on the type of chocolate that you're tempering. And it also depends on the cocoa butter that the chocolate is made from, right? Because the cocoa butter also will change depending on its region that it's sourced from.
Right. Well, thank you so much. That was awesome. We learned so much about chocolate, and we met your cat. So I think it was all around a success. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for all the people who supported you as well. And for the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's event. Please share your feedback with us and let us know what you'd like to see from us in the future. You'll see a link in the chat box, and it might show up on the screen as well. And if you can, consider supporting RCI Science's free programming. You can visit rciscience.ca/donate for more information. Next week, join us on an astronomical detective hunt spanning the globe and galaxies as we search for the source of fast radio bursts. And then next month, we're focusing on the COVID-19 vaccines. Join us in the fight against misinformation with the online trivia game Corn Trivia, following its latest update. And join us at the end of March for a panel discussion about the COVID-19 vaccines led by Science Sam herself. Also, follow along on Instagram for neat takeovers from scientists across Canada, including a research-informed look at vaccination hesitancy. Details about all of our upcoming events can be found on our website at rciscience.ca/what's on. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in and having a taste test. I hope it was delicious and fun, as well as informative. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you.